For decades, Dean Martin was the picture of ease. A cigarette curling smoke into the spotlight, a glass in his hand, a song hanging lazily off his lips as if he had nowhere better to be and all the time in the world to get there. Audiences adored him because he never seemed to be trying. He was the man who made effortlessness look like an art form, the king of cool, who could fill a room with laughter without raising his voice. But the story of Dean Martin's final years is not a story of ease at all. It is a story of grief that never lifted, of a man who slowly withdrew from the world he had once charmed so completely, and of a woman who, even after their marriage had ended, refused to leave his side while he faded. This is the story of how Dean Martin's glittering life gave way to a quiet, sorrowful ending, and of the woman who watched it happen and could do nothing to stop it. Dean Martin was not born into glamour. He came into the world as Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty steel town along the Ohio River where the air was thick with smoke from the mills and opportunity was scarce. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father a barber who had come to America hoping to build something lasting. His mother a homemaker who filled their household with music even when there was little else to offer. Italian was the language spoken at home, and for young Dino, that created an early and painful barrier. When he started school, his limited English made him a target, and the teasing from other children left a mark that would linger long after he'd learned to laugh it off in interviews. He dropped out of school before finishing, choosing instead to chase whatever work he could find. Those early years hardened him in ways that never fully showed on stage. He worked in the steel mills, pumped gas, delivered milk, and, during Prohibition, ran bootleg liquor for a local speakeasy. For a time, he even boxed under the ring named Kid Crochet, taking far more punches than he landed. He would later joke about his record in that ring, but the humor masked a young man who was simply trying to survive. It was during this scramble for a livelihood, dealing cards and singing between hands at a small illegal casino, that a bandleader heard his voice and offered him a chance to perform. That chance changed the direction of his entire life. Performing first under a stage name inspired by an Italian tenor, and later adopting the simpler, more American-sounding Dean Martin, on the advice of a bandleader who told him the change would help him go places, he began building the identity that would carry him to Hollywood. By the early 1940s, Dean's career was gaining real momentum, but it was his personal life that gave him his first sense of stability. In 1941, he married Elizabeth Betty McDonald, a young woman from Ohio who fell for him long before fame ever entered the picture. Together, they had 4 children in the span of a few years, and Betty held the household together while Dean worked his way through smoky clubs and half-empty lounges, uncertain whether stardom would ever actually arrive. It was an unglamorous, difficult chapter, built on the kind of quiet sacrifice that rarely makes it into biographies. As Dean's fame grew, though, so did the distance between them. Betty struggled with alcoholism, and Dean, now surrounded by the temptations of a rising career, did not resist them. The marriage deteriorated, and by 1949 it had ended in divorce, with Dean unusually being awarded custody of the children. Betty moved away from the spotlight entirely, living a quiet life far removed from the fame her former husband was about to inherit. She passed away in 1989, largely out of the public eye. Barely a week after his divorce was finalized, Dean married again, this time to Jean Beager, a former beauty queen whose composure and warmth would come to define much of his life. Their wedding was a Hollywood affair, with his comedy partner Jerry Lewis standing beside him. For years, Jean appeared to be exactly what Dean needed: steady, gracious, and endlessly patient. She raised not only the 3 children she had with Dean, but helped care for the 4 he'd had with Betty, effectively becoming mother to 7 children while her husband's career expanded into filmmaking, television, and the world of Las Vegas nightlife. To outsiders, they were the model of a glamorous, successful American family. But the pressures of fame did not spare this marriage either. Dean's schedule pulled him away for longer stretches, his nights grew later, and rumors of infidelity persisted throughout the 1950s and 60s. Jean endured a great deal, choosing again and again to hold the family together. By the early 1970s, though, even her patience had reached its limit. In 1973, after 24 years of marriage, Dean and Jean divorced. He would go on to marry once more, briefly, but those closest to him understood that Jean had been the true partner of his life. Even after the divorce papers were signed, something between them never fully dissolved. When Dean Martin split from his longtime comedy partner Jerry Lewis in 1956, many in the industry assumed his career was finished. Critics viewed him as the straight man who existed only to set up Lewis's jokes, incapable of standing on his own. Dean spent the next several years proving them wrong. He reinvented himself as a solo performer, taking his talents to Las Vegas, where he joined forces with Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford. Together, they formed what the public would come to know as the Rat Pack, a loose collective of performers whose chemistry, humor, and sheer charisma turned the Las Vegas Strip into their personal stage. Night after night, they filled the Sands Hotel, trading jokes and banter that felt spontaneous even when rehearsed, and audiences couldn't get enough. Dean, in particular, cultivated an image of a man perpetually on the edge of tipsy, cigarette dangling, tie loosened, drink never far from reach. It became one of the most recognizable personas in American entertainment. What most people did not realize was that the drink in his hand was frequently apple juice rather than liquor, and the loose, carefree act was a carefully maintained performance. Even his closest collaborators sometimes marveled at how convincingly he pulled it off. That persona, however, came at a cost. The more the public embraced the king of cool image, the further the real man receded behind it. Dean was, by most accounts, a private and somewhat solitary person offstage. He rarely joined the late-night gambling or after-parties that defined the Rat Pack's reputation. Most evenings, once a performance ended, he simply went home. His film work in the late 1950s and early 1960s, including dramatic roles that surprised critics who had written him off as a lightweight entertainer, revealed a depth to his talent that the public persona often obscured. His success only expanded from there. In 1965, NBC gave him his own variety program, and Dean negotiated terms that were almost unheard of for a television star at the time, insisting on minimal rehearsal and significant creative control. The show became a massive hit, running for years and drawing tens of millions of viewers weekly. On camera, he appeared utterly unbothered, as though the whole enterprise required no effort at all. That illusion of effortlessness was, in many ways, the whole secret of his appeal. But those who knew him understood that beneath the polish, fame had never filled whatever emptiness had followed him from Steubenville. Nothing in Dean Martin's long career, however, prepared him for what happened on March 21, 1987. His son, Dean Paul Martin, an accomplished actor, musician, and pilot in the California Air National Guard, was flying a training mission when his jet crashed into a mountainside during a severe snowstorm. He was only 35 years old. The search for the wreckage stretched on for nearly a week before searchers finally located the crash site, and by then, hope of any other outcome had long since faded. Dean Paul had always held a special place in his father's life. Those close to the family described an unusually close bond between the two, and friends later said that something in Dean simply broke the day his son was confirmed dead. He had weathered divorce, public scandal, and the ordinary indignities of fame across 4 decades in the spotlight. But the loss of his child was different in kind, not just degree. He withdrew almost immediately from public life. At the time, he had been preparing for a highly anticipated reunion tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., something fans had hoped for years to see. He appeared for a handful of performances afterward, visibly diminished, before leaving the tour altogether. Sinatra reportedly tried to coax him back, but Dean could not bring himself to continue. It was during this darkest period that Jean, his former wife, stepped back into his life in a quiet but essential way. Though they had been divorced for well over a decade, she began checking on him, making sure he was not entirely alone in his grief. She would often be found dining at the same restaurants where he now spent his evenings in near silence, not intruding, not pushing him to talk, simply present. It was less a reconciliation than an act of enduring loyalty, the kind that outlasts the legal terms of a marriage. Those who observed it said it was clear she never stopped caring for him, even after so many years apart. In the years that followed his son's death, Dean Martin all but disappeared from public view. The man who had once filled arenas and television screens with his effortless charm now spent most of his time alone, rarely performing and rarely socializing. Friends who visited him described someone who seemed to be waiting rather than living, going through the motions of each day without the spark that had once defined him. By the early 1990s, decades of heavy smoking had caught up with his health. Doctors diagnosed him with lung cancer and recommended surgery, but Dean declined treatment. Those close to him said he had simply lost the will to fight for more time, telling friends he felt he had already lived a full life and had no interest in prolonging it through invasive procedures. He spent his final months largely out of public view, surrounded by old photographs and the quiet routines of a life that had once been anything but quiet. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1995, Dean Martin died at his Beverly Hills home at the age of 78. The cause attributed to acute respiratory failure related to his emphysema. The news stunned an entertainment industry that had watched him recede from view over the preceding years but had never quite been prepared to lose him. Frank Sinatra, his longtime friend and Rat Pack companion, was reportedly devastated, having long considered Dean something like family. 3 days after his death, in a rare tribute usually reserved for the industry's most towering figures, the lights along the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed for 10 minutes in his honor, casinos and marquees going briefly dark in a city he had helped define during its golden era. Dean Martin was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His crypt carries a line drawn from one of his most beloved recordings, a fitting final word from a man who had spent a lifetime turning heartbreak into something audiences could hum along to. Jean Martin never remarried after her divorce from Dean. In the years following his death, she continued to live in Los Angeles, staying close to the children she had raised and to the memory of the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. Those who knew her in later years described someone who carried herself with the same grace she had shown throughout her marriage and its long aftermath, never bitter about what fame had cost her, even as it had cost her plenty. Jean passed away in 2016 at the age of 90 after a battle with cancer of her own. She was laid to rest not far from the man she had loved, argued with, divorced, and ultimately never stopped watching over. In a heartbreaking coincidence, her son Richie, who had spent much of his adult life preserving and promoting his father's musical legacy, passed away just weeks before she did, adding one more layer of sorrow to a family that had already endured more than its share. What makes the story of Dean Martin and Jean so affecting is not simply that it ended in loss, but that it reveals how much distance can exist between a public image and a private life. To millions of fans, Dean Martin was the embodiment of relaxed confidence, a man for whom nothing seemed to matter enough to cause him real trouble. In reality, he carried the weight of a difficult childhood, 2 failed marriages, the ordinary strain of a demanding career, and finally a grief so profound it seems to have hollowed him out for the remainder of his life. The persona that made him famous, the loose tie and the glass that was rarely what it appeared to be, was itself evidence of how carefully he worked to keep his real self hidden from the audiences who thought they knew him best. And then there is Jean, whose loyalty outlasted the marriage itself. Divorce, in most stories, marks a clean ending. In theirs, it marked instead the beginning of a different kind of devotion, one without the obligations of matrimony, but with all the quiet attentiveness of someone who never stopped caring what happened to the man she had once promised to spend her life with. She watched him rise to unimaginable heights of fame, watched the marriage crumble under the weight of that fame, and then, years later, watched him break entirely after losing their son, choosing to stay close even when there was nothing left for her to gain by doing so. Hollywood has always been good at manufacturing stories of glamour, but the real story of Dean Martin's final years was never one that publicists could have written. It was a story built on hard streets and harder losses, carried by a voice that could make heartbreak sound like a lullaby, and closed out by a woman who loved him long after love was required of her. Dean Martin gave the world the image of a man who never let anything touch him. Behind that image was a man who had been touched by nearly everything, and a woman who, until the very end, refused to let him face it entirely alone.